And since it's back on the grid this year, I thought I'd look into how British Racing Green came to be. Why do we use a colour so closely associated with the island just to the west of here? Now, it's hard to imagine motorsport without all the logos of multi-million or billion-pound companies splattered on the sides of racing cars, each section of a car going to the highest bidder. Remember a time when cars were painted to look like cigarette packets and liveries dictated by major sponsors creating some iconic colours and designs and stuff like that? I'm talking about the Rothmans Williams cars of the mid-1990s, the Bottolo Ford Falcon in V8 supercars, the Menard's Penske car in IndyCar, and most recently, the cars sponsored by BWT in DTM, F1 and GP2. But as we all know, that wasn't always the case. There was a time when sponsors didn't get a say in how cars were painted, and teams usually just carried the logos of their fuel supplier, the brake company, and the people that made the spark plugs, almost like they just used the stickers that came in the box. Like, I've still got this SimLabs one floating around that I've not done anything with. Before Lotus and Gold Leaf changed how racing cars looked forever, racing wasn't so much driver and team against driver and team like we have today. It was country versus country, almost like a World Cup of racing at every Grand Prix event. In the early 1900s, James Gordon Bennett, then owner of the New York Herald, organised a motor race in France in 1900, where instead of having Jaguar versus Mercedes versus Alfa versus Renault or whatever, it was Britain versus Germany versus the US versus France versus, or whoever else turned up. The entrants weren't teams like West Surrey Racing or Williams or Ferrari. The entrants were automobile clubs, the RAC, the AAA, that sort of thing. And the individuals weren't the focus as such. And while some drivers did become legends of the time, it was France who won, or Britain, or Germany, or whoever. And in the first race in 1900, the countries that turned up were France, Germany, Belgium, and the United States. Each country's automobile association paid 3,000 francs and could use 3 drivers. But the drivers had to be from the same country as the car, and every component on the car had to be built in that country. The first race was held in France, and it wasn't on a circuit or a closed street course or whatever. The cars raced from Paris to Lyon, and the race started at 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, pretty extreme stuff. Prior to the event, a man by the name of Elliot Zabrowski suggested that all the cars be painted in national colours, to make them identifiable to the crowds and make them a bit more nationalistic. And if, like me, you studied GCSE history, things in Europe were starting to get tense. The British, the French and the Germans were in a bit of an arms race that caused further and further tensions until the shooting of Franz Ferdinand lit the powder keg that started the First World War. I say, don't you know? You say, you don't know. Everyone was looking for that bit of national pride, a bit of my country is better than your country, so national colours for national teams could be used so that people could point at a car and go, hey, that's our boys there. Yeah, they got bigger balls than your lot. So as it was, the colours were assigned by the organisers, and for that first race in 1900, the French had blue, the Belgians took yellow, white was given to Germany, and red was given to the United States. And only 2 cars, both of them French, actually finished the race, and the German entry and one of the US entries didn't even start. And here's a bonus fact, the German entry was driven by the brother of Carl Benz, the Benz in Mercedes-Benz. The following year, only 3 French racers turned up, and the race was once again held in France because the winner of the previous year hosted the next race. Think Eurovision Song Contest, but it's not an absolute tacky pile of excrement that wastes everybody's time. In 1902 it was a race between the French and the British, once again in France because the previous year only French people ran. But it was the British car, a Napier driven by Selwyn Edge, that was the only finisher, and the French were suitably embarrassed by their defeat because they invented motor racing. They were good at motor racing. They were the kings of motor racing. Meanwhile, in Britain, sales of Napier cars went through the roof, at least to the ones that could afford them. It was Britain's first entry that year, and because blue had been assigned to France, red to the Americans and white for the Germans, the British hadn't got a colour on the flag left to paint the car in. Now you would have thought it would have been navy blue because Britannia ruled the waves and stuff, or royal blue because King Edward VII. But if the British painted another shade of blue, it would be too close to what the French had. so they painted it olive green. Why? British Rail. Well, not British Rail, but pre-British Rail, when all of the railways in Britain were privately owned. This being before the Railways Act of 1921 consolidated the railways into 4 big railway companies, and then the whole thing was nationalised after the war in 1948. The Flying Scotsman was green, but this was 20 years before the Flying Scotsman. But still, Britain was leading the world in machinery and railway locomotives, so they painted the cars in that colour for the 1902 event. But for 1903, everything changed. Because these races were held on public roads and went from point to point as opposed to being held on closed street circuits or purpose-built courses like we see today, there was a small issue of the law. While in France they could close roads off and hold the race with no restrictions, in the UK the speed limit was 12 miles an hour and racing on public roads was flat out illegal, and no exceptions could be made without a parliamentary act. But luckily, there was a loophole. That law only applied to the island of Great Britain, which is England, mainland Scotland and Wales. So in places like the Hebrides, the Western Isles, Orkney, Shetland, Anglesey and so on, you could get away with it. Or you could go somewhere else entirely, like Ireland. The entire island of Ireland at that point was part of the United Kingdom, and it wasn't subject to the 12 mile an hour speed limit, and racing on the roads would be totally legal. So the 1903 race was decided to be held running on a 52-mile loop that passed through towns like Kildare, Kilcullen and others. And I'll put a map up of the time, but try to make a more modern map showing the actual modern roads and stuff. But if I can't do that, it used what is now the M7, the M9 and the N80. It involved a relaxing of local laws, and the Irish authorities basically gave everybody what they needed to be able to hold the race. And as a tribute to the hospitality shown by the hosts, the British cars changed the colour from olive green to shamrock green. And that particular shade of green formed the basis of what was to come thereafter. However, and this is something that's been cried about a lot since the 2021 Aston Martin car was revealed, and people saying how it's not British racing green. It is. Now the hex code for traditional British racing green is 004225, just in case you wanted to use it to paint your own car in iRacing or whatever. But this is only an approximation, a placeholder if you will. The British Racing Green in my channel logo is 007556, which has more blue added. The old Bentleys at Le Mans, for instance, ran a very deep, dark shade of green. The Jaguars that competed at Le Mans ran a lighter, but still pretty dark shade of green that is probably the shade of green that everybody would say is real British Racing Green. Team Lotus had a more London North Eastern Railway green on the Lotus 25, but for the Lotus 49 there's a bit more blue added to it. Contrast that to the Jag that ran in Formula 1 for a few years in the early 2000s, and then compare that with the Caterer from 2013. The Aston Martin that's running in Formula 1 today is a bit like the Lotus 49, but a lot bluer, and it's similar to what was run on the DBR9 GT car that ran a few years ago. I think it was GT1 or something like that. Either way, there is no solid British Racing Green. Aston has its own version, Bentley has its own version. You get the picture. So the next time the official F1 social media pages post a picture saying something along the lines of, "Wow, how beautiful does this Aston Martin look?" and then someone goes, "But it's not British Racing Green, I wanted it to be British Racing Green." Well, you can tell them, it is. In fact, when Italy first entered the Gordon Bennett Trophy in 1904, they took black as Italy's national colour. It wasn't until a red Alfa ran and won the 1907 Grand Prix, where these colour rules didn't apply, that Italy then adopted red as its national racing colour. White then went to Japan, where it was always accompanied by a red circle, the sun on the flag, and the Americans took white with blue stripes, or inverted it. And this was quite common as solid colours got taken. Australia with Jack Brabham took British Racing Green but added gold. New Zealand had British Racing Green but added silver until Bruce McLaren started painting his cars orange for no other reason than to stand out on the Can-Am grid. And Canada ran white but with red speed stripes. But on occasion, cars built in another country have had the national colours of the driver on the car. Sterling Moss drove a Maserati in full British Racing Green in 1954 because the car was built in Italy but entered by a British team. And staying with Sterling Moss, Enzo Ferrari had allegedly promised him a green Ferrari or a blue one, depending on which story you read, if he joined the team, because, according to accounts, Enzo Ferrari rated Moss higher than Tazio Nuvolari and Juan Manuel Fangio. It is said that Ferrari would have let the car be pink if Moss asked for it. In 1968, the era of corporate colours entered the world of motorsport, with Lotus showing up to the non-championship race of champions at Brands Hatch with their iconic gold leaf colours. But that's not to say that national racing colours have died out entirely, because you do see it a lot still in endurance racing, and on the 2021 Formula 1 grid there are 4 national racing colours still out there: red, green, blue and silver. Well, sort of. I mean, there's a little bit of silver on that Merc. So that's a brief history of British Racing Green and how it came to be, as well as dabbling into the history of other national racing colours, or just national racing colours in general. So if you've learned something here today, get the thumbs pointing upwards, and if you want more stuff like this, then click subscribe with the bell on to get all the latest. Big thanks, as always, goes out to the patrons of this channel on Patreon, and if you wish to join them, or just join in Discord stuff, I'll leave all the relevant links in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. So until then, goodbye.